button. Okay, you are now officially being. Oh, by the way, is it okay if I record you?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, everyone, again, thanks for coming. Actually, turned out to be a pretty nice turnout. Yeah, that's great. Allow me to introduce Zach Kron from Autodesk. He's phoning in from Boston. You're Boston, outside Boston? Where are you?
Yeah, Somerville, close enough.
Somerville, close enough. But he works in the Boston office in Autodesk. And Zach and I have known each other for many years. We were first acquainted through work with massing in Revit. He's the author of Build Z, the blog, if any of you have ever checked out that blog. So for many years he was blogging about all sorts of cool 3D massing and curvy-wurvy and adaptive component things, and then he got heavily into Vasari when that was a thing, and then last probably 3 years now. Zach, you've been 3 years, Dynamo? Something like that?
It may be 4 years now. I know we started talking about it in 2012 and presenting it, so yeah.
Yeah, so about 4 years, Dynamo, and he's been amazingly helpful to me in my journey through Dynamo, and he's got some great stuff to show us here. And take it away, Zach. Thank you.
Cool. Hi, everybody. So let's see. I guess I understood from Paul that the group is a collection of engineers, architects, and everybody has had some amount of experience with Dynamo. I mean, so is everybody, who here has used Dynamo? I'll raise my hand. It's always one of these questions where there's always people that sort of like, I think so. Like, have you ever taken a philosophy class? Maybe. It is like Revit in that many people have dipped their toes in it. Nobody feels particularly a mastery, and I'm just trying to sort of get a sense of, you know, have people like placed a node, they've experienced to some degree. It sounds like everybody's had some amount of experience. I won't start with the basic level of like, here's a node and here's how you wire it into another thing. So what I was thinking today that I would do is I would talk a little bit about some of the new stuff that has come out recently with the 1.2 release, and tell you a little bit about where we're going with it, and along the way do a little bit of live demo of some of the things that are in there. Has anybody here used the latest download, which is Dynamo 1.2? It's also the stuff that's available in Revit 2017.1. Couple people? Okay. So how many people here are on 2017 on a regular basis, Revit 2017? All right. And Paul, I know that you've actually been like documenting stuff, but 2017.1, the latest update release, anybody using that yet? Okay, a couple people. Cool. All right, now I know where you're all from. You are already sharing my screen, obviously. Let me hide this thing. Are you guys like watching yourselves?
No, we're okay, but I am going to hide our meeting too.
Cool. So, let's see.
The screen a little bit too on the side.
So again, I'm gonna just start off by walking through a little bit of what's new, with an assumption that you guys know where it's coming from. One of the big things that happened in 1.2 was we did a whole bunch of new Revit enhancements, which was exciting for us for a number of reasons. We added a lot of nodes, about 113. Which is a tricky thing to do because you sort of have to curate each one of these nodes. You kind of need to translate what the Revit API wants you to do and how humans can understand it. And we also did it in a different way than we usually have, which is that we started working with people who are outside of Autodesk to write a lot of these nodes. We collaborated in particular with a group called Thornton Tomasetti, which is a structural engineering and consultancy group based out of New York City and London and a couple of other places. And we worked with API developers that were in that company. So really trying to make sure that we were still doing the development from a user perspective, and also with the idea that this is the kind of development that actually really relies on publicly available APIs and is part of sort of the spirit of the open source nature of what Dynamo is. So the way that we did this was this external consultant developed a bunch of nodes. We reviewed them, we brought them in, and we had a lot of dialogue back and forth about that. And it's exciting for us because it means that we can essentially start scaling our team to bring in people from outside of Autodesk to expand and enhance the functionality that's available out of Revit. This particular push for new nodes, we emphasized annotation. Up until now, there were basically no out-of-the-box nodes that dealt with annotation, and that's kind of a big deal with Revit. So we wanted to finally really open up that can of worms and get into it. We're going to continue working this way with more Revit-specific functionality and enhancements. The next round of enhancements are going to be dealing with model auditing and queries. There's a lot of tools that are built into the Revit API that allow you to do things like interrogate the model for things that aren't necessarily obvious on the surface. You can start asking the document things like, give me all of the elements that have sketches with more than 150 lines in them, or because that can lead to performance problems and other things like that. So a lot of BIM managers want to be able to go in and take a look at their models and sort of suss out those sorts of details. Or things like, give me a list of all the loaded families that are larger than 10 megabytes. So you can really start going through and really sort of optimizing your model for better performance. After we do that project about auditing and querying the model, we're going to refocus again on exposing more element creation methods. So there's a lot of tools that we still haven't gotten into, like by face methods and that sort of thing. This is the whole list of the stuff that came out in Revit 1.2. It's a big list. Again, it's mostly around, you don't have to read all of this, and there isn't going to be a test at the end. But most of this, again, has to deal with annotation functionality. I'm actually just going to show you a little bit about some of these tools that are in here, along with the idea of saying that we are going to work from, going through the menu here and saying, well, you know what, we haven't really exposed much here in annotation. What we did was we also looked at very popular packages and the nodes that were exposed in there, and tried to also learn from the way that they're exposed, particularly things like Lunchbox and Clockwork that exposed a lot of this sort of annotation functionality and the terminologies that they use that seem to be working very well for people. So, for instance, here I'm just going to open up my Dynamo, and everybody loves the sample model as I understand it, and I'll open up this guy. So this is just one of the sample files that we released also that gives examples of how these new nodes can work. I don't know how well this is coming through. I'm on a Retina display, so the detail might be really weird. Let me know if this stuff is legible or not. We okay?
Yeah, if you zoom in, it looks good.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So if you go into the Revit menu, one of the things that we did through neglect was you can easily see which nodes are new because we didn't get around to adding new icons for them. So bug or feature, you decide, but all the new stuff you can identify because they all have the sort of the default icon now. So you can go through and you can see in the element category, for example, there's get location, get materials, set location. So these are particular tools around, not just interrogating the model, but actually modifying it. A bunch of these things are actually fairly new kinds of concepts for Revit interaction, like set location. This actually allows you to move things around, as well as things like in the family instances, getting the family, getting the host, getting the type, this way of sort of interrogating the model more. So in addition to the annotation functionality, we've also generalized a bunch of the tools that have been pretty important to people in terms of not just understanding where an element is in the model, but modifying where the element is in the model, and also understanding where it comes from, so you can start going back up into the hierarchy of a Revit model to get hosts and hosts and hosts back up into the whole structure of the model. This particular set of nodes is an exposure of the room functionality. So before we didn't have any room tools at all. You can see there's a nice collection now, not only to create rooms. So if you have a spreadsheet that has certain room information, you can actually start laying out actual rooms inside of your project. You can get and set a lot of the information that goes along with rooms, and you can also start extracting the geometric aspects of the rooms. So this one in particular, what have we got in this guy? This is one that was, again, a very popular tool in Lunchbox, which was a tool that went in and extracts the geometric representation of the room's boundaries, and you can either go, center boundary, core boundary, there's all the sort of niceties of the particular ways that you can look at rooms. One of the advantages also of our developing it this way is that while Nate Miller's Lunchbox tools are really, really great, but they do rely on a couple of methods that are going to almost necessarily be a little bit slower. So the particular way that we develop these, you can get into fairly large models and still have very snappy responsiveness in this kind of extraction of room boundaries. It's something that we heard a lot from users was they really liked getting boundaries so that they could do things like generating new wall finishes or better ways of visualizing floor areas, those sorts of things. But it did start to bog down at larger and larger models. This should be pretty efficient. It should be pretty effective. So again, this is just sort of one example of a bunch of the tools that were exposed. You can make revision clouds and all the rest. By the way, all the stuff that I'm going to talk through, examples like this, on the 1.2 blog post, the announcement for when we came out with this has links to a lot of the sample files if you want to try out some of these tools. So if you go to dynamobin.org blog and go to the 1.2 release, we have information about things like the Revit nodes. There's a downloadable zip file that has not only the complete list of all the new nodes, but also sample files, so you can sort of tab through these things and look at what the new functionality is. So that's new Revit nodes, and one of the things that I always sort of assume is that people know that Dynamo and Revit are actually separable things. 90% of our usership comes from Revit right now, so most people understand Dynamo as a part of Revit, which is part of what Revit is working to do, is to make Dynamo feel like it is more a piece of the whole fabric of the application. But the reason that I emphasize that these are new Revit enhancements is that Dynamo is in fact something that is separable. It can operate outside of Revit. We are working with other host environments right now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. The next thing that I wanted to point to was list management. How many people in the room have used a list map operation? Anybody? A couple of people? All right. I will illustrate what list management is about for those who are not so familiar. When you're dealing with nested lists, so I have all of the windows on all of the floors of my building. Generally, the way that Revit is going to represent that is that you're going to have a list that represents all of the floors of your building, and then you're going to have all the windows inside of all of the floors. That's a nested list. And asking what the first item in each nested list is has been something that has been not so fun for people. And I'll show what that means too. Hold on. List at level.
Oh, Zach, we're still seeing just the cameras.
Here, hold on. Just the cameras. Oh, I stopped my screen share for some reason. How's that?
And we're back. Yep.
And we're back. Okay.
We're back. Yep.
So let's see. Listed level. Yes. So if you were to, for instance, have this kind of list where you've got two lists and each list has two lists in it and each one of those two lists has other things in it. Imagine this can be windows on each floor, this can be bolts on each curtain panel, it can be any number of things. This is how Dynamo stores that kind of information. It's hierarchical. It allows you to sort of keep track of things that might have meaningful organization rather than flattening them all out. The way that you query that to get information out of it, and a relatively simple way to look at it is to say, get item at index. Get item at index says, give me a list of stuff and I'm going to get the things from it. So right now this is getting the 0th item of the list that's coming into it. And what that means is that it understands not that each one of these items is your list, but that all these things at the very top level are your list. So if you're going to get the 0th item, because we do 0 indexing, it's the first item, it's going to get all the stuff that is in here. So good so far? Up until now, and I'll do it this way because y'all are experienced Dynamo users, if you wanted to get into this list to get at these pieces, you would have to do list map. What list map says, in effect, is do this to all of these things. And what that means is that it can go into each one of these lists and operate on it. So if I want to get one level into this list, so now my stuff is here, not here. And I'm assuming that my pointer is showing up, but what I'm saying is that I want to get into this list rather than this list. I can use list map and I can tunnel into it, right? So now, if I look at this list, rather than getting that top level thing, I'm going one in. And then if I want to get even further, then I do another list map, and now I can get all the way down into it. So this is the problem that we are trying to solve, of this being not any fun, and nobody really wants to do that. So the list at level functionality are these little arrows that we have here now, which is to say there's a new set of tools called use levels, and you'll also see that the preview bubbles now have some helpful little indicators over here. And what this indicates is the nesting of the list. We've got all the stuff down here at one end, which is essentially the base of the list, and we're calling that level 1. In counting out from inside, we go level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So all of these things have an address within their hierarchy, and this simply allows you to dial up that hierarchy. So if what I really want to do is I want to get into my list, what I can use is use list at levels, and you can see it starts popping into a different place in my list. And again, it's counting from the inside out, right? So now I'm getting A0, A0, B0, B0. So it's getting me the first item of each one of these lists. If I expand that, I can see it goes first item, first item, first item, first item. Maybe I want to back out a little bit further, and now I can go out to level 3. So if I look at level 3 starts all the way out here. And then I can access this first item or this first item. All of that is to say there is a logic behind this, but generally whenever I'm using it, what I do is I turn on list at level and I start pushing buttons until I get what I want. And that was one of the things that we wanted to do, is we wanted to give an explainable logic for how you can navigate through lists, but also give people an opportunity to just open it up, start clicking buttons until they get what they want. So there's a logic to it, but you don't even really need to have it. If you've got stuff that's nested in a list and you want to get at it, turn on list at level, start clicking buttons. Any questions on that stuff so far? Because I'll just keep plowing through, but I'm happy to talk to people about this. If this was like bananas and doesn't seem understandable, all the better. That is all the better for questions, not that I'm making it sound bananas.
Actually, Zach, you know the, can you open it up again?
Yeah.
You know what it does at? There's like another checkbox in there?
Ah, okay, good question. So right now I'm at level 2, and one of the things that you'll notice is that I've got A0, A0, B0, B0, but it's flattened everything out. That is, it's given me that information and no more. What keep list structure does is it does just that. It keeps the structure of the incoming list. So that incoming list had built into it a certain logic. So if we go back to the idea of this being windows on a floor, and I want to get the first window on every floor, then I'm going to want to keep that structure for some downstream use. And keep list structure allows me to basically say, yes, I want to keep that structure, or no, I don't want to keep that structure. One thing to notice about that is that if you get into a workflow where you've got multiple different nodes, multiple different input ports, and you want to keep the structure of the incoming list, you have to choose which list has the structure you want to keep. It's kind of a detail, but I'll just mention it here. So that's what that tool's about. It's basically the choice between flattening the list or not flattening the list.
Cool.
Listed level. Tell your friends. Okay. Stability. This one is one that I'm particularly proud of. It doesn't make for good television, so I'm not going to show you sort of, look, it's not crashing. But one of the things that we did, 2 releases ago, I could have told everybody, hey, we turned on something called more instrumentation, which basically collects more information about crash data and the way that the application is being used, and everybody would have said ho-hum. We did that a couple releases ago, and now we're actually starting to reap the benefits of it. By collecting more information, we've been able to get some very targeted work around what kind of crashes are happening for people, especially the ones that are really elusive and hard to reproduce. The result of that is that between 0.91, which is the Dynamo release that went out in 2017, so for most of you, if you've got 2017 and you haven't done any upgrading or anything else, you've been using Dynamo 9.1. That was what was available out of the box when 2017 came out. We are now 4 times more stable. Hold on one second, my son's asking a question. What's that? Okay, thanks. Sorry. This is a family affair here. So we, comparing 0.9.1, which is the release that went out with Revit 2017, and 1.1, which is the release that we are just moving off of, the time that will elapse on average between when you crash is 4 times longer. It's actually getting closer on to 5, but just to be conservative, we rounded it down to 4. So, if you have been using 9.1 and you found that it is, that it's disappearing on you, that you're getting a lot of errors and you're not sure about things, definitely upgrade. You're going to see a big improvement in that. And then between 1.1 and 1.2, we've been using more of that data that we've been collecting to target whatever the biggest crashes are that are left over from that. So we got about 30% of the rest of the crashes that were left in 1.1 in the latest release by gathering that kind of data and really being able to sort of target our improvements that way. There's a lot more for us to do. We're getting a lot more information now back from the application about how it's functioning. So we're hoping to sort of keep the pressure on for stability as we go forward. And another item that came through in Revit 2017.1 is we've started working a lot closer with the Revit team. To a lot of people, Autodesk is just one big monolithic entity and it makes the software. But like any large company, there's a lot of different different groups. And the Dynamo group is actually an independent group from the Revit team. We are all sort of one big family. But we are making the Dynamo stuff and the Revit team is making the Revit stuff, and we have made a big effort to start working a lot more closely together. One of those big efforts is the Dynamo Player. This is a feature that has come out in 2017.1, and it's essentially a buttonizer. So if you are a person in an office who is comfortable making scripts using Dynamo, and you've got a bunch of people out in your office who are not, essentially this allows you to share functionality with those other people. And just to show you quickly what this looks like, if I go back over here to my Dynamo, and you have, no, I don't care about that. You will see up here next to Dynamo over in Visual Programming in the Manage tab, there's the Dynamo Player. What the Dynamo Player allows you to do is essentially just run Dynamo headless and run scripts that you have somewhere else on your machine. And what it does is it presents those just as a simple push button functionality. So for instance, maybe I have a script. These are the sort of the out-of-the-box things that ship with it, and I'll show you some other ones too. I've got a script that goes through and it looks at all the sheets and it reads all of the names of all the sheets and it changes them all to be uppercase. Maybe kind of a trivial example. This may or may not be something that comes up in your office, but the idea of saying that somebody's gone through and they've named all of your sheets and maybe they've not done it in a uniform way and you want to go through and change all the names so that they're all the same. This is a relatively simple workflow. It's not too complicated. You could tell people to sort of run this thing on their own. But what this allows you to do is to say, well, instead of that, I'm just going to share some scripts that may be something that people use on a regular basis within their workflows. So, you know, if I'm looking at, I think I've got sheets in this one. Yeah. I've only got 2 sheets, so it's like big deal. But here I've got my floor plans, and I can run my script, which simply does that one operation, and it capitalizes them. This could be something that, you know, you've got, you know, a junior architect in the office, and you say, go through all 151 of our plans and change them all to uppercase. And then somebody's also going to have to go back and check and make sure that they didn't misspell anything on the way or whatnot. Anyway, you have some automated task that may be something that's common to your workflows, and now it can just be something that can be distributed through buttons. The way that this works is that you can browse to a folder that has whatever scripts that you might need. Here, I'll go to my other ones that I have. Where are those? Here, I'll give you a peek of my RTC workflow. There. So you browse to a folder, you load it up, and you basically can get all of the scripts that you want to run as buttonizers. So if your office has a collection of scripts that are useful for you to run on different projects, however you might want to do it, you can just point to that folder and all those things will now be available to anybody in your company that you want to have access to these sorts of things. So this one's kind of fun because it, let's see, this script does what? It, sorry, isolate category. This one goes through and it colors all the walls by their function. I've heard of this from a couple of folks who say, you know, they want to be able to go through all their projects and audit them to sort of see if people were accurate in putting interior walls and interiors and exterior walls and exteriors. So this script just goes through and it looks at all the walls and it goes back up into their type and then it looks in their function and then says for each unique kind of function, color all the walls that same thing. So you could quickly go through and look at this and say, okay, the reds are all clearly interior and the blues are exterior. Do I really want these things to be exterior walls or are these more appropriately called interior walls? You can quickly audit them. Whether or not that one works for you. The idea is that this can now be operated by people who might be dynamophobic, or you have a number of these different things that are appropriate for you to run in series, and then you just want to click through and say, run this one, then run this one, and this one. Anyway, Dynamo Player, it's pretty fun, and available in Dynamo, in Revit 2017.1.
Say, Zach,
Hey.
is there a way to set the default location for the Dynamo Player folder where it starts? Because when I was looking at it, I believe it's like C drive program data or someplace like that.
Yes, there is, and I think we added it to known issues, but I know that there's actually a discussion on the forum that identifies this.
Deploy it to starting in the
Yes, here, I'm going to just paste this into
you go anywhere you want, but instead of having the user do it,
into the chat.
deploy it that way initially. Right.
This is how you can do that. Until there's an option of customized deployments. Yeah, so there is a folder where that default location is located. And so if you're doing deployments or if you want to just go through and change a particular thing on people's machines rather than opening up Revit and opening up the player and then repathing it, this is a method to do it. And again, I just posted that into the chat if you want to take a look. So far, so good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome. More to come on the player. Still refinements. There's other things. You know, people. One of the first things people ask about it is, can I give it different inputs? Right now, it's just you play it and that's it. There's been some very interesting things that almost immediately started happening, like within hours of 2017.1 going out. I saw people posting these things where they had started adding their own inputs to it, essentially. So what that looks like is, here's an example where a user has put in a Python script that does selection and throws up windows. So with this guy, I have a script that just allows you to pick an element and it will tell you where it is in XYZ coordinates. So if I run it, it puts me into a pick editor, so now I can go through and I can say, this tree, where is it? That tree is at point blah, 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 blah. Again, sort of a trivial example, but the idea is that there are methods right now for people to essentially hack this to create more selection interfaces. There's a lot of discussion about that on the forum. It was a known thing that we were going to be releasing this with relatively sort of simple user interface with the idea that it would be expanded in the future. But if you're impatient, you can certainly do this sort of stuff. And again, if you look on the forum, there's a bunch of discussion about these sorts of functionalities. Player. The dictionary. So a lot of people, when placing nodes, and they've found a functionality that they think does what they want it to do, but they're not exactly sure how to wire it up. This is more of a documentation problem than trying. There are different ways that we could address this. One is to try and make the nodes as understandable as possible, but in the end, many of the nodes have complex interfaces or complex needs for how to plug them together. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make it a more documented and documentable set of functionalities. And for that, we've started building out something called the Dynamo Dictionary. It's available right now at the dictionary.dynamobim.org. We're going to be adding a couple of direct links to it from both the application and from dynamobim.org. But in the meantime, that's what you just need to enter. And I'll show you a bit of what this looks like. Let's see, I'll just, do I have it open? No, I don't, so I'll just open it. Dictionary. So the Dynamo Dictionary is a browsable and searchable interface to look at the nodal functionality that is in Dynamo. When you get to the individual bits of functionality, what's a good example? Let me see. How about something in geometry? Yeah, let's do this. Closest point to. How about that one? You have a node. You want to figure out what it does. You want to get a little bit more information on it. The tooltips give you a little bit of information. The inputs and outputs tell you a little bit more about it, but you want to get some more in-depth information. Most of the out-of-the-box nodes, not Revit-specific nodes, now have an entry in the Dynamo dictionary. Our first pass is to cover all of that sort of core functionality, so lists, geometry, math, operators, all that sort of stuff. The next phase is going to be looking at Revit functionality and packages to allow more information. But what each entry provides is essentially a more in-depth explanation. So for geometry, closest point to, out of the box, if you just hovered over it, it would be able to tell you, obtain the closest point on this geometry to the other, and you would get some input information. There's more information now in these things that says things like geometry closest point, finds the closest point from one geometry to another, adding a 3D point in the document. This example finds the closest point on one sphere to another. This example. Yes, examples. So along with editable and expandable in-depth descriptions, it also has a downloadable DIN file and a visual of what that DIN file is telling you. So geometry closest point, you can see how it will be wired up and what its results will be in an image. And if you really want to get into it, you can download the Dynamo file and you can open it up and use it. I think that now we're at something like 400 of these examples, and we're just going to keep adding to it. You, as a user, can also add to it. This is an editable piece of text that you can do here. Basically, the way that this works is that you make your changes. You can upload example files. You can upload images and submit them. We then have human beings on the other side who are just going to verify that this is actually adding new information that is not harming, sort of making sure that nobody's messing with the system here, and then we'll submit it in, and it will then be live for everybody else to use. So we are trying to get the community involved in building up our knowledge base, and I think it'll become even more important as we add other functionality to allow packages and Revit nodes to be added into here. So that is the Dynamo dictionary. Any questions on that one? All right, we shall march on. Some sundries. Couple just sort of smaller enhancements that came in 1.2. Often requested, oops, not that application. Often requested feature is the ability to turn on and off the visibility of, to know about the visibility state of nodes. So for instance, I'll just open up one of our samples, which is executing, and yeah, so this is just one that's making some geometry, very nice. I want to know which one of these nodes is previewing geometry and which ones aren't. So for instance, if I look at this one and say, if I select geometry trim, I can see that it is previewing this geometry back here. But this guy is not. And in the past, you would have to go through and interrogate the node and see that indeed preview is turned off on it. Now there's just a visual indicator. So I can see that geometry trim is previewing the geometry in the background, and geometry translate is not. It's a small change, sort of important, so that you can go back and you can understand what's going on in your graph. There's another sort of couple of other smaller addendas to that sort of graphical interface change, like we have a freeze functionality which has been around for a little while, which just stops a node from executing. So this is executing, but this is not doing anything anymore. It's been around for a little while again. You can do things like you can freeze Revit nodes so that while you're making your changes in the graph, it's not actually updating your Revit. People used to be just unplugging and replugging nodes. So freeze just sort of now has a different visual aspect, so it's easier to read which things are frozen, which things the preview is off, and then which ones are just operating on a regular basis. And what else have we got on our list? Other smaller things, primer localization. So the Dynamo primer is a good starting point for lots of people to be learning about Dynamo and getting up to speed with what it can do. We started the process of translating it a little while ago, and we've just gotten it up to date so that the German and Japanese versions of the Dynamo primer are now up to date. Maybe not as important for Chicago, but who knows. And a lot of bug fixes. There's a longer list of bug fixes in the README file and on the GitHub page, but I'll just say that there's a lot of bug fixes in the geometry operations and a lot of crash bugs that have been fixed in 1.2. And just before we got started, Paul and I were just talking about a couple of the other applications that are now using Dynamo. And I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of people just sort of think of Dynamo and Revit as sort of peas in a pod, synonymous, that is where Dynamo shows up. In fact, Dynamo does show up in other applications as well. There's a workflow to exchange Dynamo files with Formit, and there's a bunch of projects that we are working on for having Dynamo projects running online in a couple of experimental workflows. One is called Fractal, which if you were at RTC, you've probably seen a few of these things where we're basically looking at using Dynamo to generate design options and to sort of do early stages of optimization workflows. This is some of the stuff that we have that's a bit more sort of future-oriented looking. One thing that I was pretty excited about this year was that we have our first Dynamo integration with an AutoCAD vertical. So Advanced Steel, which has a lot of partnerships going on with Revit right now around doing sort of increased level of steel detailing, also now has a full integration of Dynamo where you can run it within the application itself. People are using it both to interrogate what's going on in their models, but also for the creation of moderately complex and very complex steel structures directly through the same Dynamo interface that you will have already gotten familiarized with in Dynamo for Revit. So you can make some amount of logic and you can save out that file, and if you open it up in Dynamo for Advanced Steel, then you can then use that logic to create things that are appropriate for Advanced Steel. Again, it was very exciting for us to start seeing the little A showing up in the corner of Dynamo because it really does indicate the manner in which Dynamo is a separable logic engine that can run on multiple different platforms. So this isn't everything that's sort of recently come out, but these are some of the sort of highlights of some of the things that we've been working on recently. I thought I'd go through a little bit and talk about some of the things that are coming down the road. You know, much of this stuff is, you know, there's no secrets in most of what we do because Dynamo is developed on an open source base, so, you know, we're free to talk about what's going on, but you can also even go in and you can see the code that's being worked on. Just in case you don't want to go into the code to see what's coming, I can tell you a little bit about it. Mesh Toolkit. This is sort of a transition from where we are now into where we're going. There is a package called the Mesh Toolkit, which is essentially the exposure of meshing tools. Meshes are different things than surfaces and solids. There's different advantages and disadvantages to working in meshes. The biggest advantage to working with meshes instead of surfaces and solids is that you can make lots of them very fast, and you can do things like colorization and manipulation of them without having the sort of overkill accuracy in some cases that you get with surfaces and solids. Mesh Toolkit has been around for a little while. We've been enhancing it, and it's our goal with it is to allow for better analytic workflows. So for instance, if you want to visualize sun paths, if you want to look at things like view angles and get lots and lots and lots of surfaces that are showing smooth gradations of color. The way that you would have to do this in the past was using the extremely accurate surfaces and solids that were available out of the box with Revit. And that can be slow. So the ability to quickly generate these sort of analytic surfaces is something that we are now working towards getting available out of the box. But in the meantime, while we're working on it, these tools are available through the Mesh Toolkit. This workflow that I'm showing here on the upper right is by Justine Olsen, who has been experimenting with some of these nodes to do things like analysis of topography coming out of Revit. So if you were going to go through and you were going to do this sort of false color analysis on something like topography, you would actually have to convert everything into a surface, which becomes very heavy. The particular way that surfaces work, here's a little piece of computational geometry information for you, is that every triangle starts off as a rectangle, and then it is cut in half, so that then you have a triangle, and each one of those surfaces is immensely accurate, which means that it can also be very slow when you use lots and lots and lots of them. For the accuracy needed for visualization, there's a big difference in what you need for them. So you can actually take something like this that is a highly faceted piece of geometry, and you can very quickly look at what it's doing and visualize things on top of it. We've also added tools so that you can do things like Boolean operations and a lot of healing on it. If anybody out there has used a tool called Mesh Mixer, which is a tool that is primarily for doing things like mesh object cleanup in preparation for 3D printing. Mesh Toolkit essentially exposes all the functionality in Mesh Toolkit. And there's a lot of toys in there for us to start exposing, and there's a lot of workflows that can be enabled by meshes. 3D printing along with things like analysis workflows and other kinds of modeling operations that are really much more effective using meshes than surfaces and solids. Also coming up, we are working on the package manager. The package manager right now is a very simple interface, simple search, not a whole lot of richness to the interface, which is very nice for those of you who are big minimalists, but not so much if you want to know more about a package before actually committing to installing it. So the new UI that we're working on is a lot more expressive. It's a web-based interface, so that's going to allow us to use it in different environments. It also allows you to search by the individual nodes that are inside of packages. So when you have something like Clockwork or Lunchbox, which sometimes have hundreds and hundreds of nodes, you can actually search by the name of the node that you're looking for. Maybe somebody has sent you a graph that has a node in it and you don't know where it comes from. You can go to the package manager, you can search for that node by name, and you'll be able to find it with this interface. It also allows individual package makers to upload imagery so that they can give a better sense of what's in the packages, and it also gives a list of the nodes that are in the package. So you get a little bit more knowledge of what's in it before you commit to getting it. And it also will allow for better filtering. So for instance, all of the deprecated nodes that are currently up on the package manager by default will be filtered out so that you don't have to see them. And there's other sorts of niceties like that in the works. Getting a little further out, some of the things that we're working on right now are new node editing environments. So like I was saying before, Dynamo doesn't just work in Revit, it works in a number of, it can work and it does work in a number of different environments. We want to keep being able to provide Dynamo functionality in an ever-widening sphere of applications and host environments. By working in a editing environment that is based on a browser technology, it means that we will be free of needing to rely on PCs. It also means that we can potentially be free of relying on installed instances of Dynamo. It just opens up a lot of possibilities for Dynamo running on the cloud, Dynamo running in the Mac, Dynamo running in whatever environment can access a browser window. Again, this is a bit more farther afield, but I want to just sort of talk about some of the stuff that's in the works. And in general, the Dynamo team, which the way that we operate within Autodesk is that we operate within the generative design team. Generative design team is a larger group that includes Dynamo, it includes the Formit team, it also includes the Insight 360 group, and a few other technologies in that as well. We're going to be working a lot more closely in the future on a collaborative environment, working more closely with the Formit team, and working on some joint projects involving analysis workflows that are coming from Insight 360, the sort of the direct manipulation environment coming from Formit, and the compute environment that's coming from Dynamo. All into one great thing where we hold hands and sing Kumbaya together. That was sort of a mad dash through a whole bunch of stuff, and if there are any questions on this, I would love to see if I can answer them.
So are you saying someday, Zach, I'll be able to run Dynamo on my phone?
Well, you can already. So let's see, dynamo.autodesk.com. This runs on your phone. And what that looks like is, don't look while I type my name. So we haven't gotten into Dynamo Studio, but Dynamo Studio is the sort of the standalone environment for Dynamo on a desktop environment, where you can publish out interfaces to online an online tool set that allows you to interact with a Dynamo graph. So this is a Dynamo model that I authored in Dynamo Studio. It makes some rectangles, it does some rotations, and I've exposed some of those pieces so that I can adjust things like the proportion of those rectangles, I can adjust the number of segments of this, and I can do things like adjust the rotation of these guys and see all of it update. So I have a simplified interface that allows me to be interacting with a web-based instance of Dynamo. Again, this is a bit more experimental work that we're doing right now, but the idea being that Dynamo is something that is abstracted out from Revit and even from Windows architecture that's going to allow us in the future to be able to do some pretty exciting things with web-based applications and other tools that are not necessarily connected to your desktop workflows.
Anyone else have questions for Zach? Fire away. You got Autodesk ears right here. Wow, quiet group. Good thinking. Here we go.
I can ask a question. It might be a little involved though, but I've been dealing with just like a light and vent schedule, which seems to be a huge issue that is unresolved in terms of like curtain walls. And so I was trying to tinker with Dynamo and find a node that connects curtain panels with rooms. I just wanted to sort of run this by you, just in case you know something that you know of.
So, curtain panels with rooms?
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
Right.
So let me see if I understand. So you've got you got a bunch of rooms, you got a bunch of curtain panels. Are you trying to find, you know, what part of the curtain system is associated with what room?
Right. Actually, I started with the very basics of like connecting windows to rooms, like in the same sort of schedule through Revit. But considering that our projects are mostly sort of curtain panel I went beyond the windows and thought, like, would there be a way to get, you know, my panels associated with rooms through a Dynamo node, but I wasn't able to find anything.
Right. I've seen some fairly similar kinds of workflows. There's some really cool stuff that's coming out of people using Dynamo with MEP. And the thing that resonates from what you're saying is that doing things like I've got ductwork or I've got chillers that are in rooms, and I want to isolate each piece of MEP equipment to the room that it is in, and then transfer some information from the room to the equipment.
Right.
So, you sit down and you tell a junior architect to sort of go through the whole model, and they can do it. So how do you describe that to a computer so that it can execute the same sort of thing? Both of that project that I was describing and the thing that you're describing would probably rely on the same kind of thing, where you essentially get you get a collection of all of the room geometry, which is going to be, it will define a volume of space, and you get a collection of all of your panels. And the logic of it would be something like find the center point of all of my panels and find the the cubic or solid volume of my room, and for each panel give me the room that it is closest to, which is essentially what they're doing with the MEP workflows. So in one list you've got all the rooms, and in another list you've got all the panels, and you plug them both into a closest point to, distance to. There'd be some amount of saying you've got the volume, you've got the panels, and distance to, and for every panel, whichever room it is, it has the smallest distance to, that's the one that you're going to pair it with. I mean, just sort of off the top of my head, that's what it sounds like. And it sounds like something that people have accomplished with other things. That would be the starting point. I would also very much recommend going onto the forum and asking if somebody else has done this already. You'd be amazed at how many of the things that people are doing have been attempted by other people in the past, and the people on the forum are very generous on saying, yeah, sure, I did that before, and here's my graph, or here's a picture of my graph, or here's the kind of logic that I pursued on it. So it's definitely a Dynamo solvable problem. There isn't anything in that sounds out of range. And it's funny because it's also one of those problems where I hear a lot from people when they say, you have all these geometry tools in Dynamo, but I don't use it for doing geometry operations. We don't do twisty towers, and we don't do curvy-worvy stuff, so why would I be interested in the geometry tools? The problem that you're describing is actually a geometry problem, and it's actually a complex geometry problem too, in that it is the association between a whole bunch of objects with a whole bunch of other objects. And that's what those tools are for, so that there's sort of a robust way for you to approach this kind of problem. Sorry, I can't just like point to the answer, but I know that that is a solvable issue.
Thanks. That's great. That was a great direction. So we'll look into it.
I could certainly echo what Zach said about the forum. Folks there are really, really terrific about replying with relevant answers and quickly. Sometimes it's over your head, so be prepared. They might fire out a bunch of Python code at you, and that might be something you might need to clarify a little bit more. But yeah, the forum's a really great resource.
Zach, I haven't used Format yet, but I've kind of taken a look at just the kind of options in the Revit, add-in buttons and stuff, and it's a couple buttons about creating Revit families based off format geometry, and I think there's a SketchUp import one too. But do you see the Dynamo working with format is kind of another path to make native Revit geometry, kind of based on your Dynamo data, I guess?
So I have heard the other way that I think I've heard this question stated before is, can you embed a Dynamo script in a format geometry so that it keeps executing that same logic when it goes over to Revit? That's not something that we're actively working on, but is that the kind of thing that you're wondering about, like the authoring environment of Format being able to create more sophisticated Revit family geometry?
Potentially, yeah. I've used, I forget what node it was, but I've created like geometry as like a Revit family instead of, yeah, I'm just wondering how, like if that enables Dynamo to create more native Revit geometry, I guess.
Yeah, it's not an initial target of ours for that. There's we've actually a ways back in the very early days of Dynamo, we actually did a prototype that was embedding Dynamo scripts inside of Revit families. That was exciting and dangerous because it essentially allowed you to put somewhat arbitrarily scripted interactions into the regeneration cycle of families, which can be, you know, it sounds very cool, and it was very cool, but it also means that you start to get things that can be very intensive in terms of regeneration and performance for big models. It isn't being actively pursued right now that I know of, but there have been a couple of different stabs at that sort of thing. If there's workflows that you're actually curious about pursuing, I'd love to sort of talk to you more about it, sort of offline, about sort of the things that you can see applying it to, because those kind of things do sort of get into a pretty interesting realm of sort of customized family behavior. So right now, the way that Dynamo interacts with Revit, for instance, is that it will manipulate parameters and it will create stuff, but it doesn't create parametric relationships that are embedded in the project itself. That is a potential thing that we could be doing with Format to make those sort of scripts be part of an embedded workflow with the objects in Format. It is one of the things that we're considering, but moving that stuff over to Revit is something that is a little bit further out in terms of something that we would be looking at addressing.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Zach, I haven't looked recently. Have you guys connected Dynamo in any way to global parameters?
Yes, and I can't honestly remember if it's in, I believe it's in the development builds. This is the kind of stuff that's like, you know, if we weren't open source, I would say, hold on one second while I take a look and then come back. But I know that we have worked on that, and the only thing that I'm not sure about is if we exposed it in 1.2 or if it's in the development stuff. And yeah, I will check right now. This is Studio. What is it that you would be looking at doing with global parameters in Dynamo?
I think we're thinking about code-related things, or we're looking at global parameters we're using to drive code dimensions.
So I could take a look at the on GitHub, which is, you know, where all of our source code lives. That's definitely being worked on. I'm not sure when it's going to be available, but I know that we're looking at that. The global parameter stuff is interesting also just because it's such new functionality that I think people are still figuring out how much it's going to get adopted sort of in the out-of-the-box functionality for it. So I don't know, have you experienced anybody else sort of poking around with that with automated processes or plugins that are are dealing with global parameters?
I'm not aware of any of that.
So yes, I know that people are working on that.
I have one other question, if nobody else.
Yeah.
What is best practice in terms of linked models in Dynamo? Like, does it actually, like, how, I'm not sure, like, how it works. I know it doesn't work very well when you have several models open under the same session of Revit, but when it comes to actually having linked models, does it apply to everything that is linked within that model session?
Let's see. So the linked model setup, we've got very little in the out-of-the-box functionality in Revit that specifically works on linked files. There's a number of packages that do expose a lot more functionality with linked models. Off the top of my head, it's Clockwork and I think Steam Nodes are two packages that have functionality specifically about interrogating and manipulating linked models. In a nutshell, the way that Dynamo works is that it is like a faster, more accurate view. So if there is stuff that you can do in the Revit model through the user interface, generally there is a way to access it through the API, which is the way that you can sort of through code access what's going on in Revit. We haven't spent much time within our team itself looking at linked files and how you can deal with them, but again, there are a bunch of packages that do have tools for that. So what your experience was that when you have multiple Revit files open, not just linked files, but multiple files open, that it's not interacting well with them?
Yeah, I believe there's some sort of like confusion or something when there are several Revit models open. Like, which one does Dynamo actually apply to?
Oh, okay. That's an easy file. That's an easier question though, because what Dynamo does is that Dynamo can point at one and only one Revit file at a time. So whatever file you have open at the time when you launch Dynamo, that is the file that Dynamo attaches to and will talk to. So you can open up multiple views of that same document and it'll still be operating on that document. It can repoint to whatever the active view is, for instance. There are different tools for actually just monitoring specific views or whatever your active view is, but it will only point at that file that was active when you started Dynamo. If you close all of your Revit files, so you're back to the sort of zero state, so right now I've got this file and it is pointing at my active file. Here, I'll do this. If I open up a new file, I'm going to get a little warning here at the bottom, which says Dynamo is not pointing. I don't know if you can read that, but it says Dynamo is not pointing at the current document. What that means is that even though this is what I'm looking at, Dynamo isn't looking at this. Dynamo is looking at the file that was active before. So if I look at all the files that are open right now, if you think of this is what Dynamo sees. Dynamo sees all this stuff. And just because it's occupying your whole view doesn't mean that it's understanding that that is a new project that you want to look at. If I close out, I'll turn this into manual for a second. If I close out the other one, you can see now it says Dynamo is now running on document, and now it's repointing to the only active document. So it can
active document in a session when you're running Dynamo.
Sorry, what was that?
So basically you cannot have more than one active document, or you cannot have more than one file open to run the session.
You can have multiple files open, but Dynamo is only going to be pointing at one of them. And the way that it decides which one it's going to work with is the active document when you started it up, or the only active document that is available.
Okay.
It's actually it's a request that we've heard a lot about. Can I just manually repoint Dynamo to another thing? We haven't been able to expose that kind of functionality, but essentially, you would need to close down and reopen in this active document, or close down the other active document, so there's only one active document left. And we're at the end of our time. Thank you. Good night. Well, no, not really. I can stick around if people want to, but I also want to keep people around if people have to go, because I think that this is towards the end of your time.
Yeah, we're close. Anybody else have any other questions for Zach? No? Well, Zach, thank you very much.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure, and I don't know if anybody's going to AU, but I'll be there on Sunday. So, Paul, I'm sure I'm going to be running into you.
Yes.
All right.
A beer and a cigar.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Okay, all right. So, wait, when I do this. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Good. So, yeah, why don't you see?
Let's read them.
Yeah, see what he's up